I saw it when I was a very young man in Chicago, and it was very difficult to see Citizen Kane. Now we think of it as a classic, but when it came out, it was blackballed. It was not allowed to be shown. It was appreciated mostly just by aficionados. I was knocked out by the movie. I was just, of course, I was interested in photography even then, and Greg Toland's work was just the most exciting visual treat that I could imagine.
Well, I remember the first time I saw the picture was in Hungary in 1952, because in those days, you know, we couldn't see American movies. I mean, it was the height of the communist oppression. And as film students, we were in the advantage position that the government let us see films which they thought that we should see if we wanted to become good filmmakers. And Citizen Kane was an exception. But only film students could see it. Now, when they projected that film in the auditorium, hundreds of actors and writers and other film people who couldn't see the film came in and wanted to get into the door. And we ended up actually opening the door, and we had 100 people standing and in the room, and 40 seats. We had only 40 seats for us, you know, cameraman and director, students. And I tell you, it was at the end of the movie, it was a standing ovation. It was like everybody loved the film so much.
Hello. Hello. Stand by. I'll tell you if we want to run it again. Well, how about it, Mr. Ralston? How do you like it, boys? Well, 70.
First time I saw Citizen Kane was in a theater in Los Angeles. It must have been about 1958. It was the old Carmel Theater. It was run by a man named Charlie Tarbox, who showed a very eclectic group of films, foreign films, modern films. It basically was a pretty junky theater. It was a grindhouse, but he would show wonderful films. And I remember he got a print of Citizen Kane in there. I had heard about it, and a friend of mine had told me, don't see it on television. Whatever you do, you've got to see this film in a 35mm print in a theater. Well, I did, and Charlie Tarbox cared enough to run it in the proper 1:3:3 ratio and show it as it had been. And the print was probably only 2 years old. It was from the re-release, the 56 re-release, and it was perfect in every regard. And seeing it in such good circumstances, I gotta say, I was knocked out. No matter what I'd heard about it before, I wasn't prepared for what an incredible piece of cinematic history it was. But it played like a brand new film at the same time. I don't think it was possible for any of us to feel the same impact that the people who saw it in 1941 felt, because it's one of those pictures everyone proceeded to steal from, but you got such a feeling of vitality from the filmmaking, and I think that's what sticks with you when you look at that picture, as to how much fun Orson Welles and all the people making it were having. And I think that came through then. It was an inspiration to me as somebody interested in cinematography to see this and to see it looking as it had looked then. I think I emphasize this so much because so many times today you have whole generations of people who have never seen a black and white film projected in a theater. And I think we have a whole new generation that thinks black and white is an optical effect used in music videos. And if they could only see what the classic works looked like when they were presented as they were presented originally, they'd have a different idea.
Mr. Leland!
So the other day I was looking at a couple of scenes at the movie. I mean, it's just unbelievable how well it is directed, acted, and photographed. I think photography is probably the best part of the movie. That's the part which I think it's always going to be fresh for all audiences, all the times, because you have everything what a cameraman dreams about, you know. Silhouettes, smoky interiors, things done with light, fabulous things were done with light, you know, and in black and white. You don't miss the colors. It's a classic.
It is our understanding to the chapters in Mr. Thatcher's manuscript regarding Mr. Kane.
That's all I'm interested in. Thank you.
I think one of the things you have to remember about Citizen Kane is that you had these two people, this is from a cinematographer's point of view, Orson Welles and Greg Toland meeting to do this film. And here you have Welles, just 25, coming from at least 10 years of mastering stagecraft and at least 5 of mastering radio. And a lot of people forget how you can't really understand Welles as an artist until you understand his years in radio and how much he brought to film from radio. And you've got Greg Toland, who was a young cinematographer. I think he's just about 40 at this time, and he'd been a protege of George Barnes, a great cinematographer. And during the 30s, he had proceeded to do what every cinematographer dreams of doing, just an incredible variety of work, basically showing he could do anything. And I think when you take somebody with that kind of a mindset and he meets Welles, and a lot of Hollywood was immediately prejudiced against Welles and very jealous of him, but I just like to think that Greg Toland must have seen the opportunity he had to really do something different. And one of the things I've heard is they looked at a lot of films together. They studied a lot of film history, and many of the elements cited, you know, in Citizen Kane that people talk about, the deep focus and the ceilings and so on. Yes, they'd all been done before, but a lot of the techniques that they used, they were bringing together in the most exciting way for a true style, a true, I don't know, concept of a film that hadn't been brought off the same way ever before.
News on the march!
And you just think about, like, that first sequence, the idea that Welles and Toland sitting there saying, now, how can we really get this genre down of the newsreel, the March of Time? How can we make it look so real? Well, you study that, and you realize that no one has ever done anything like it since it, until 40 years later, you had Woody Allen and Gordon Willis do it with Zelig, of taking a form of newsreel and of showing all of its stresses and strains and the notions of duplicate footage and handheld cameras and everything else, making it a perfect send-up and at the same time a believable example of that genre. Well, that whole thing is used so often throughout Kane, and it was that approach of let's take something that's been done before and look at it from a different angle. And even within the film, that the opera scene of showing scenes from 2 different points of view, all of these tools were used in such an exciting fashion. I mean, that to me is what makes it so fun to look at even today. In the early 60s, I worked in theater, and I got a chance to meet Maurice Seidemann, who had done the special makeup for Welles on Kane and several other things. And the difficulty of those experiments, when you think later how long it took prosthetic makeup to make another big advance, and it really wasn't until Dick Smith in the late 50s, early 60s, started making advances similar to the ones that Seidemann did. And this is, again, there's so many breakthroughs evident in every area of the film.
Excuse me, sir, but I...
Welcome, Mr. Kane. Welcome.
Greg Toland worked very much on source lighting things. He wanted, when they were around windows, you really felt like the light was coming from the window. He used a lot of low lights. Low lights were seldom used in films in those days, except for spooky movies, for horror movies. And yet, he used light which looks like the light you get when light comes in a window and bounces off the floor and fills the full side of the face. Big sections of the frame darker than in most films. In every respect, quite advanced and quite different, quite exciting.
You still eating?
I'm still hungry. Now look, Mr. Carter, here's a front-page story in the Chronicle about a Mrs. Harry Silverstone in Brooklyn who's missing.
Well, you know, the breakthroughs were really to shoot wide-angle lenses and low angles and show all the ceilings, every place, all the time. I mean, in those days, you know, it was difficult to shoot that. In Hollywood, they always put the lights on the catwalks. That was the only place they put the lights. Now, when you go low angle and shoot up, and you see the catwalks, you see the ceilings. Now, where do you put the lights? You know, they didn't have sensitive film in those days. They needed a lot of light for exposure. And they needed a lot of light, especially when they wanted to shoot with such a depth of field what they did. Because all the time, everything was in focus. You know, you see in 2 shots in depth, you know, and both of the people were in focus. Now, they needed at least a 5-6 T-stop there, or maybe an 8-stop. Oh, they needed a tremendous amount of light to create that. And it doesn't look at it in that way, just like it looks like that they use small units like we do use today, to achieve the same result. And I still try to find out where did they put those lights.
I've arranged for a tutor to meet us in Chicago. I brought him here with me, but...
We have a joke in cinematography because we've always talked about cinematography being a painting with light. And one of our jokes is to say, you look at some of these sets and say, this was lighting with paint. Actually, shadows were painted in, perspective was drawn in sets and so on. And I like to joke with production designers and say, actors made up their lines as they went along in the movie, and I said, and cinematographers make up the sets, but when you see a film like KANE, you realize what a coordinated effort it had to be, and what Perry Ferguson must have gone through to meet all of the fantastic thoughts that Wells had, and ideas that had to be discarded. You just wonder, well, if he only could have stayed happily inside the studio system and continuing to work, what we would have gotten out of it if he was this masterful with his first time out.
I don't know how to run a newspaper, Mr. Fetch. I just try everything I can think of.
Charles, you know perfectly well there's not the slightest proof that this...
It's a beautiful classical lighting style. It is thoughts behind each setup, It's not flatly lit. It's using a lot of directional light and a lot of silhouettes and a lot of moody shots, The sets are not overlit like the tradition in Hollywood used to be to see everything. You would only see the important things in a frame. That's why it's so easy to see Citizen Kane, because only the important things are lit. The not important things are in shadows. And the light sort of directs the eye what to see. Always the light is very important. It takes the eye to the important element of the composition. And what is secondary important, it keeps it in shadow. You can see it later if you have time to see it. A moving movie image, it doesn't stay there for a long time. A painting you can study for hours. A moving image you can study for a very short time, 3 seconds, 4 seconds, 5 seconds, depending on the cut. That's why it's so important that the lighting is directional.
Declaration of Principles. Don't smile, Jedediah. Got it all written out. Declaration of Principles.
The reason you don't see a lot of the photographic techniques in Citizen Kane in today's films, I think, a major factor would be color. There's no question about it. You've got a whole different way of telling the story visually with color. And I'm speaking of today's contemporary controlled use of color. I'm not talking about pretty color or anything, but I'm talking about dramatic use of color, and how many of us will defend it as a wonderful medium. I mean that I'm a fan of black and white. I would love to do a black and white film. And if I were to do a black and white film, I assure you, I would probably have to go back and try to rediscover some of the secrets of black and white that are lost, because we let black and white die as a medium temporarily. Only now are the laboratories learning to process it again. And in some cases, we've lost the secret of making some of the film stocks that used to exist. I mean, they really literally can't make the infrared stock that they used to use outside during the day to create night scenes, and true day for night scenes. I mean, these are secrets that get lost. If you don't keep working at it, you're not going to have them.
KANE is always important for me because occasionally I would just go and look at it. I have a laser displayer myself, and that gives you a pretty good quality on the screen. And it's very inspirational, no matter what kind of a movie I'm making, because the basics are there, the basics of movie making, storytelling, how to be interesting, and how to light so it's an interesting composition, an interesting lighting. And I did 2 pictures lately, and before each pictures, I went to see Citizen Kane just for inspiration. It was 2 Jakes and Bonfire of the Vanities. Both pictures we used built ceilings, so we always had low angles and wide angles and a lot of depth of field, a lot of realistic lighting, a lot of interesting lighting. It was obvious for me that I had to see KANE for that.